Good morning, Mrs. Silver. Alfie's looking well this morning.
Oh, isn't he gorgeous?
And now, as he looked down into her smiling face, gazing up into his own, he thought, for the thousandth time, how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love.
I do so wish he would grow a little faster. Do you know, in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces? That's almost nothing.
What does he weigh now?
Just 13 ounces. How miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up.
Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here surely was his big chance. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it quickly. Roald Dahl once said, never do anything by halves if you want to get away with it. Be outrageous, go the whole hog, make sure everything you do is completely crazy. And in the story he wrote titled S.E.O. Trot is about a man who's willing to go just that far to win the woman he loves. Enjoy his lies, and remember, if you go all out and win, you get a better story. S.E.O. Trot by Roald Dahl. Mr. Hoppy lived high up in a tall building. He had always lived alone, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy's jutted out a good deal further than his own. Thus, he always had a great view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and had never been able to give her even the smallest hint of love. Every morning, Mr. Hopper and Mrs. Silver shared polite conversation, the one looking up, the other looking down. But that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy it seemed like 1,000,000 miles. He longed to invite her up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time the words were forming on his lips, his courage failed him. As I said, he was a very, very shy man. Oh, if only I could do something tremendous, like saving her life or rescuing her from a gang of armed thugs. Oh, if only I could do something that would make me a hero in her eyes. If only. Mrs. Silver already gave her love to somebody else. This was a tortoise called Alfie. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years and lived on her balcony. Now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony, watching Mrs. Silver giving Alfie his breakfast.
Here's the hot lettuce for you, my darling, and a piece of crispy celery, and some fresh tomato.
Good morning, Mrs. Silver. Alfie's looking well this morning.
Oh, isn't he gorgeous?
And now, as he looked down into Mrs. Silver's smiling face, gazing up into his own, he thought, for the 1,000th time, how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love.
I do so wish he would grow a little faster. Do you know, in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 12 ounces, more than 3 ounces. That's almost nothing.
What does he weigh now?
Just 13 ounces. How miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up.
Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here surely was his big chance. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it quickly. Mrs. Silver, I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's really what you want.
You do? Oh, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things?
Wait there. Mr. Hoppy was back on his balcony in a few seconds with a piece of paper in his hand. I'm going to lower it to you. S.E.O. Trot, S.E.O. Trot, Teg, Regib, Emok, no, S.E.O. Trot. What does it mean? Is it another language? It's tortoise languages. Tortoises are very backward creatures. Thus, they only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it?
I suppose so.
S.E.O. Trot is simply tortoise spelled backwards. Look at it.
It is.
The other words are spelled backwards too. If you turn them around to human language, they simply say, tortoise, tortoise, get bigger, bigger, come on, tortoise. Now, what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and say these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Let me hear you practice them. Very slowly and stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver read the whole message out loud in tortoise language. Not bad. If you do it properly, I bet you anything you like that in a few months' time he'll be twice as big as he is now.
I'll try it. I'll try anything. Of course I will. But I can't believe it'll work.
Oh, you wait and see. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was quivering all over with excitement, but there was a lot of work to be done. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. He had to choose them very carefully. He chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only a little more than Alfie's 13 ounces, some a great deal more, but he wanted none weighing less. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no more than 140 tortoises. But it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. On the first exciting afternoon, after he made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, he went out onto his balcony. He leaned over the rails and saw Alfie basking in some sunlight. Hello, Alfie. You're about to go for a little ride. He hauled Alfie onto his balcony. He went back into his living room and weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales. After that, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through the masses of tortoises, looking. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked all the... He had to find one that, first of all, had the same color as Alfie, and second of all, weighed exactly 2 ounces more. From his vast collection, 2 ounces is not much. It weighs less than a small hen's egg. But you see, the important thing about Mr. Hoppy's plan was that this tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice it. From his vast collection, it was not easy for him to find the tortoise he wanted. This was tortoise number 2. He took tortoise number 2 and put it onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. Would she notice the difference between the tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. Alfie, my darling, Mummy's back. Essio trot, teg, regib, emok, no, essio trot. Good evening, Mrs. Silver. Alfie's looking well this morning. How is Alfie tonight?
Oh, he's lovely, and he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this. It must be the magic words.
Mr. Hoppy waited 7 days before making his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver had left for work, he lifted tortoise number 2 out onto his balcony below and brought it into his living room. Now, to find one that weighed 17 ounces, exactly 2 ounces more. This was tortoise number 3. He put tortoise number 3 on to Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you might have guessed, Mr. Hoppy's plan was a simple one. If something grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice it's growing, especially if you've seen it every day. It's the same with children. They're actually growing tall every week, but their parents don't notice until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it. Don't hurry it. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hasn't noticed a thing. One evening, a startled cry came from below Mr. Hoppy's balcony. Ah! Look! Alfie's grown enormously. Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He's twice as big as he is now. Oh, you great, big, wonderful boy. Look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you. Come down at once, my dear man. Come down and see the wonders you have worked. This is it, he told himself. The greatest moment of my life is coming up right now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. When he was 3/4 of the way downstairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver waiting for him. She flung her arms around him. You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. Come inside at once, my dear man. Come inside and let me make you a cup of tea. It's the least you deserve. Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlor, sipping on his tea, he looked across at the woman sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back. That smile, so warm and gentle, gave him the courage he needed. Mrs. Silver, will you marry me?
Why, Mr. Hoppy, I never think you get around to asking me. Of course I'll marry you.
It's all due to Alfie. Good old Alfie. We'll keep him forever, they said. The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy went back and took all his tortoises back to the pet shops. A few months later, Mrs. Silver became Mr. Hoppy, Mrs. Hoppy, and they lived happily ever after.